Once you earn your private pilot certificate, you'll have the ability to fly a lot of different makes and models of airplanes. But there are also a lot of restrictions you should be aware of. Not only could you get asked about these restrictions on your check ride, but you also want to fly legally after you get your license. And this is going to allow you to keep those private pilot privileges. So let's look at some of these things that you need to know. When we're looking at the privileges and limitations for private pilots, the main regulation we need to start with is FAR 61-113. But before we discuss that, I briefly want to point out that there are a lot of different sections of the Federal Aviation Regulations. There are even a bunch that you won't find in your FAR AIM or even in ForeFlight, so it can sometimes be kind of tough to find what you're looking for. Now, I plan to discuss most of the regs you need to be familiar with as a private pilot, but the two main regs you should have bookmarked are Part 61 and Part 91. Part 61 deals with the certification of pilots, and Part 91 deals with general operating and flight rules. And that makes it a little bit easier to find the regs you're looking for if you know where to start. And this is going to be really important for you on your oral exam, because if the DPE asks you a question and you don't know the answer, start by asking yourself, is this a pilot certification question or is this an operating or flight rule? Now you at least know which book to start looking through. And the limitations and privileges of a private pilot are going to fall into that pilot certification category. So this is where we want to start digging for that information in Part 61. So let's take a look at FAR 61-113, where we'll find the private pilot privileges and limitations. And notice that it says this is to operate as the pilot in command. Well, what the heck does that mean? If you ever find anything like this in the regs where you aren't sure of the definition of something, you can find a lot of answers in Part 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations with the definitions and abbreviations. And according to FAR 1, we see exactly what it means to be the pilot in command. We often abbreviate that PIC, and the PIC has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the flight. This means that you are the person responsible for everyone and everything on board the aircraft. This is something that you need to take very seriously, and it also means that you have the final say on what happens aboard the aircraft. So if you're flying with your wife and she wants to eat at Chick-fil-A again and you don't want to, you get the final say. I'm just joking about that, but in all seriousness, once you get your license, you will be the expert. If you think you need to turn around and go home because the weather's getting too bad, turn around and go home. It's okay to get input from the passengers, but you should be making the final decision. I like to get my passengers involved in looking for traffic, birds, and other stuff like that. It gives them something to do, and it also lets them see that I'm actively trying to keep everyone safe. But ultimately, I'm responsible for making sure they're safe. In fact, if we were to have an in-flight emergency, as a pilot in command, I've got a lot of options. According to FAR 91.3, in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So during an emergency, we can actually break the rules, and that's pretty crazy. But what kind of trouble can we get in for doing that? Well, if you take a look at the next line, it says that if we deviate from one of these rules, we only need to send in a written report upon the request of the administrator. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because if the lives of your passengers are at stake, if you break the rules in an emergency, the FAA might not even ask you why you broke them. Let's take a look back at the definition of the pilot in command. The PIC has been designated as pilot in command before or during the flight. This just means that if you and your buddy both have your PPL, you need to be clear who is the pilot in command of the aircraft. Here's a good briefing I like to use when I'm flying with friends who have their private pilot's license. To change the controls, my plan is to verbalize the change of controls 3 times. If you hear 2, the controls have changed, but we'll shoot for 3 today. Now, if we lose comms for some reason, you can tell me that you want me to take the controls by pushing the rudder pedals 3 times, and I'll shake the yoke 3 times to indicate that I've taken control. Push to pass and shake to take. But if that's so confusing, we can raise up our headset and just yell over the engine noise if we have to. If there's any confusion, just make sure you know who's flying the aircraft. And let's say whoever has physical control of the aircraft is the pilot in command at that time. Okay, last but not least, the pilot in command must hold the appropriate category, class, and type rating if appropriate for the conduct of the flight. And that just means that if you have your airplane single engine land category and class rating, you can't be the PIC in a single engine C airplane or a multi-engine land airplane or something like that. There's nothing that says you can't be at the controls, but you can't be the pilot in command. Now this brings up an important point. The pilot in command has a lot of authority, but during your training, you're technically not the pilot in command unless you're flying solo. But you should start acting like the pilot in command as early on in your training as possible. Now this is going to be tough for some of you that are an introvert, but it's important for you to be assertive when you're talking to ATC, when you're doing checklists, and when you're briefing your passengers. You're going to make a lot of mistakes in the beginning, and that's totally normal. But I would way rather have a student be assertive and make a mistake than to be more laid back. It's much easier to catch mistakes and correct them early with assertive students. In addition to that, as the pilot in command, you also need to start getting used to giving your passengers a pre-flight briefing. And while you might not have any passengers with you during any of your training flights, it's the PIC's responsibility to brief the passengers about the safety equipment on the aircraft and how to exit the aircraft if there's an emergency. This would be like the location of the fire extinguishers, having your passengers put on their seatbelts, explaining how to put on the seatbelts, and other stuff like that. I'll discuss seatbelts and shoulder harnesses more in another episode. Okay, now that you know what the pilot in command is, let's look at your privileges and limitations as the PIC if you're a private pilot. First of all, you cannot act as the pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire. Nor may that person for compensation or hire act as the pilot in command of an aircraft. In plain English, you cannot get paid to fly people or stuff around with your PPL. In order to do that, you have to have your commercial certificate. In fact, if you look down at this paragraph here, it actually says that you cannot pay less than your pro rata share for the expenses of a flight with your passengers. This includes fuel, oil, airport expenditures like ramp or tie-down fees, and rental fees. And you have to split these costs evenly with your passengers. You can't pay just a couple dollars and let them pay the rest. You have to split the costs evenly. And the reason for this is because the FAA looks at flight time paid by passengers as compensation. And you can't fly for compensation without that commercial certificate. Now there is one exception to this rule, and that's if you're flying as a pilot in command for a charitable, nonprofit, or a community event. In that case, you can fly and act as a PIC and not have to pay anything. In situations like this, the FAA doesn't look at it like you're getting compensated for your flight time because you're volunteering your time for the charity or the event. Just be aware there are some rules that you need to follow in FAR 91-146 if you want to do some of this. Now, if you're interested in getting involved in search and location operations, this would be another way that you could fly for free. And as long as it's for local, state, or a federal agency, you can get reimbursed for your flight expenses as a private pilot. And you don't have to pay to act as a pilot in command. There are also organizations that specialize in search and location operations like the Civil Air Patrol. You can fly for these guys for free as well if you want to get involved in something like that. Now that I've told you that you can't get paid to fly with your private pilot's license, let's look at one tiny little loophole. As you can see here, there are a couple ways you can act as the PIC of an aircraft and get paid. This is possible if the flight is only incidental to that business or employment, and the flight does not carry passengers or property for compensation or hire. Okay, so here's a couple things you can do as a private pilot and get paid. The first of which is probably going to take a little extra training, but you can get paid to perform aerobatics as a private pilot. Now I think this would be a pretty cool gig, but you kind of have to know someone to get involved with stuff like that. You could also be an airplane salesman. Airplane salesmen will often show potential customers the capabilities and handling characteristics of an aircraft. And he's not really getting paid to fly the airplane, he's really getting paid to sell the airplane. And showing the capabilities is just a small part of that. Just be aware that if you want to do that, you need to have at least 200 hours of logged flight time. Another thing you can do to make money as a private pilot is to tow gliders. But in order to do that, you have to meet a few additional requirements. First, you have to have at least 100 hours of pilot and command time in the category and class of the aircraft you'll be towing with. If an airplane requires a type rating, you also have to have 100 hours in that type. In addition to that, you have to get specific ground and flight training from an authorized instructor, then get an appropriate logbook endorsement from them once the training is complete. And you'll have to do or simulate at least 3 glider tows during that training. Now to stay current, there are a few options depending on the type of certification you have. But if you only have a private pilot certificate, you have to perform at least 3 glider tows every 12 calendar months. And you have to be with a fully qualified tow or glider pilot when you do it. Now let's take a look at some of the restrictions you have as a pilot until you get a little bit of additional training from a qualified instructor and a logbook endorsement. You'll find these in FAR 6131. Now we've discussed this a little bit in past lessons, but some airplanes require a special type rating in order to act as the pilot in command of that aircraft. As you can see here, you need a type rating to fly a large aircraft. Well, what the heck is a large aircraft? Once again, we can find the exact definition of a large aircraft in FAR 1 with the definitions and abbreviations. It looks like a large aircraft means that the max certificated takeoff weight is more than 12,500 pounds. So if it weighs more than 12,500 pounds or it has a turbojet engine, we need to have a type rating to operate that. And in addition to that, there are a few aircraft that the administrator has designated as needing a type rating. And I honestly don't personally know of any aircraft that fall into this category, but comment below if you know of one. Anyway, another restriction you have as a private pilot is that you cannot operate a complex aircraft without getting some additional training from an authorized instructor and receiving a logbook endorsement. Now, you may be wondering, what the heck is a complex aircraft? And of course, the FAA likes to make things hard by not putting that definition in FAR 1. You have to look at the beginning of Part 61 to find the answer to that. There are a few additional definitions and different things up in FAR 61.1 as well. And this is where we can find out exactly what a complex airplane is. As long as an airplane has retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller, they consider it a complex aircraft. Even if a computer controls the pitch of the propeller, the airplane still falls into this category. For example, on the C-130J, we don't control the pitch of our propellers. We have special computers called FADECs that take care of that for us. But I'd still call the C-130 a complex aircraft, wouldn't you? Now, one important thing to keep in mind about complex aircraft is that the horsepower of the engine doesn't matter. As long as it has retractable gear, flaps, and a controllable prop, it's a complex aircraft. And you need to have special training and an endorsement from an authorized instructor in order to be able to fly one of these. There's nothing that says how long this training needs to be, but if you're getting your complex endorsement, you can expect ground training on the different systems. Then the instructor has to make sure that you're proficient in the airplane. He can also give you the flight instruction in a full flight simulator or a flight training device as long as it meets all the requirements. And once the training is complete, he'll endorse your logbook and you'll be good to go. Okay, I just told you that the horsepower doesn't matter for complex airplanes. But you also have a horsepower limit as well. And in order to fly an aircraft with an engine that has more than 200 horsepower, you have to receive special training from an authorized instructor and get a logbook endorsement. Now here's where things get a little weird. What if I was rated to fly a multi-engine land airplane and both engines were 200 horsepower? Would I need to get this 200 horsepower endorsement? This is kind of a trick question, and the answer is no, actually. The requirement is more than 200 horsepower per engine. So even though this plane has a total of 400 horsepower, we technically don't need the training or an endorsement. As long as we have our multi-engine rating, we're good to go. But if I have even one engine that has 201 horsepower, I've got to get the appropriate ground and flight training and get the endorsement in my logbook from an authorized instructor. And just like the complex endorsement, this can also be done in a simulator. One thing to keep in mind though is that the complex and the high performance endorsements are two different things. Just because I have a complex endorsement, that doesn't mean I can jump in a high performance aircraft. I've got to get a separate endorsement for that. I can receive the training at the same time in the same aircraft as long as it meets the requirements for both, but I still need to get both endorsements in my logbook to be legal. Another one I briefly want to mention is the tailwheel endorsement. If you learn to fly on an aircraft with tricycle gear like a Cessna 172 or a Piper Cherokee, if you want to operate a tailwheel or conventional gear aircraft, you have to get some additional training and an endorsement. And there's a reason for that. Tailwheels are a little different than the trikes you may have learned on. I actually made a video on when I got my tailwheel endorsement, so if that interests you, you might want to check that out. But this reg right here is where you'll also find the training that you're required to get if you want to get that endorsement. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about all the requirements you need to meet in order to operate as a pilot in command and to carry passengers. As you may remember, your private pilot certificate doesn't ever expire. But if you want to operate as a pilot in command of an aircraft, you need to get a flight review every 24 calendar months. You'll find that requirement in FAR 6156. Now this isn't a check ride or anything like that. This is just a little ground and flight training to help you bust off the rust and make sure you're safe and proficient as a pilot. You have to have at least 1 hour of ground instruction and you have to have at least 1 hour of flight instruction to meet this requirement. Once that's complete, the instructor will endorse your logbook for another 24 calendar months. And in case you forgot, a calendar month just means that this endorsement expires the last day of the month, 24 months after you took the training. I do want to mention that 1 hour of ground and 1 hour of flight instruction is the bare minimum. So don't be surprised if the instructor you choose requires a little bit more than that. It's always good to refresh on all the stuff you need to know as a private pilot. And it's good to have an instructor challenge you with the stuff in flight that you may not have worked on for a while, and to make sure you continue to improve and stay proficient. If you're trying to save a little money on your biannual flight review, instructors have the option to assign you some ground lessons in the FAA Wings program and use that instead of the ground training. But no matter what the case, you've got to fly with an instructor every 24 calendar months and get that endorsement if you want to operate as the pilot in command. I do want to mention that if you go overdue on your flight review, it's not a big deal. You just can't act as the pilot in command until you knock that out. You don't have to retake a check ride or anything crazy like that. As soon as you do the review and the instructor signs off that endorsement, you're good to go. There's just one other requirement if you want to carry passengers, and we'll cover that in just a minute. But before we go into that, there are a couple other things you can do instead of taking a biannual flight review. First, if you happen to pass any additional practical exam for another rating, this resets the clock on your flight review. Let's say I passed my instrument check ride 1 year after I got my PPL and I passed it on March 10th. I would need a flight review on March 31st, 24 months from the date I passed my instrument check ride. Unless of course I decided to move on and I passed my commercial check ride as well during that time. And that would reset the clock again. A pilot proficiency check works as well, and you can get these from an examiner, an approved pilot check airman, or an Armed Forces examiner. But I'm betting most people watching this video don't fall into this category. Okay, so if you have a current biannual flight review, this allows you to operate as the pilot in command. But if you want to fly with passengers, there's also some currency requirements that you need to meet. You'll find these requirements in FAR 6157. If you want to carry passengers when you go fly, before you can do that, you need to have done 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class of aircraft in the last 90 days. If a type rating is required, those would need to be done in the same type of aircraft as well. As I've discussed in the past, category and class would be like airplane single-engine land, or airplane single-engine sea, or airplane multi-engine land, or airplane multi-engine sea. I can't do my takeoffs and landings in a multi-engine land airplane, then take passengers up in a single-engine land airplane if I'm not current in the single-engine land airplane. Before I can take my passengers up, I need to go accomplish 3 takeoffs and landings by myself or with an instructor. Now during the day, these can be touch and goes if you want, or full stop landings. The one exception to this rule is if you're flying a tailwheel aircraft. Those takeoffs and landings need to be to a full stop. If you get your tailwheel endorsement, you'll find that slower airspeeds and taxiing are usually where new pilots tend to struggle. So to carry passengers in a tailwheel, you have to completely stop the aircraft before you make your next takeoff. Okay, so another requirement you need to be aware of is if you want to carry passengers at night. If you want to be able to carry passengers at night, the daytime currency does not work. You have to get 3 takeoffs and landings at night within the last 90 days. And these takeoffs and landings cannot be touch and goes. They have to be full stop landings no matter what type of aircraft you're flying. And once again, these takeoffs and landings have to be in the same category and class of aircraft, and type if a type rating is required. Now, once you start flying more regularly, you'll notice that the night currency is a lot harder to keep up with. I fly the C-130 at night quite a bit more than the small training planes, and I have to regularly check my logbook to make sure I'm current to take passengers in my Cessna 172 at night, because the C-130 is a multi-engine land airplane. Just because my currency is good in a multi-engine land airplane, that doesn't make me current in a single-engine land airplane. I still need to jump in and do 3 takeoffs and 3 full-stop landings at night to be legal, and take passengers with me if I haven't had 3 takeoffs and landings at night in the last 90 days. The reason for this is because night landings are usually just a little bit trickier, and the visual cues are a little bit different than what you're used to seeing during the day. But if you do get current in a certain category and class of aircraft at night, that means you're also current during the day as well. But if you want to take passengers with you at night, you have to do those currencies at night. Okay, this brings up an important question. What are we calling night, and what time do we need to do these takeoffs and landings to a full stop if we want them to legally count? To make things easy on us, the FAA has made the definition as simple as possible here in 6157. For the purpose of night currency, you have to have 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop from 1 hour after sunset until 1 hour before sunrise. And if you want to know the exact time the sun sets or rises, you can literally Google search it and find the answer in about 15 seconds. It looks like the sun sets here exactly 5:12 p.m. That means that if I want to go accomplish my night currency, I need to wait until at least 6:12 p.m. That's 18:12 for my friends out there on 24-hour time. Then it looks like the sun rises at 7:32 here today, so I can wake up early if I want and knock those out any time before 6:32. With that in mind, every other reg uses something a tiny bit different to determine the legal definition for night. If we look back in FAR 1, we can get the exact definition. It says that night means the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight, as published in the Air Almanac, converted to local time. I'll be the first to admit that the Air Almanac is probably the most boring book of all time, and to be honest, it's a little tricky to read, but typically you'll find that evening civil twilight occurs about 30 minutes after sunset, and morning civil twilight occurs about 30 minutes before sunrise. The exact time depends on your latitude and the time of year. The easiest way to find the exact time is to Google search civil twilight and the city where you are and use a website like this right here if you need that information. As you can see here, today in Bonita, Oklahoma, sunset is at 17:11 local and civil twilight ends at 17:40. Then sunrise is at 7:31 local and civil twilight begins at 7:02. And as you can tell, it's roughly 30 minutes, but it's not exact. That's why for the purpose of takeoff and landing currency, they made it an hour so there's no confusion whatsoever. You can just Google search the sunset time wherever you're at, and if you're going to have passengers with you an hour after sunset, you need to make sure you're night current before you do that. Okay, there's one more thing I want to discuss today, and this might be the most important part of today's lesson. I've mentioned this regulation in other videos, but I want to bring it back up to show you something. In FAR 91-103 it says, each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. Remember, you're training to be the pilot in command. Now it goes on to mention the mandatory pre-flight information you have to know before every flight. But I want to give you an acronym that will help you remember everything you need to have checked or know for the flight. Wants. Weather. This one's super obvious. You need to make sure you're going to be legal and safe when you go fly. If you don't know your weather minimums, I got some videos to help you learn what those are. As a private pilot, you need to make sure you're only flying when the weather is VFR until you earn that instrument rating. The A in our WANTS acronym stands for Alternate Plan or Activate Flight Plan. For VFR, you technically don't need to file an alternate airport because you should only be flying when the weather's good, but it's always smart to have a backup plan if the weather is marginal at your landing destination. Then of course, if you want to file a flight plan, be sure to activate that. As you know, you can do that in the air, but I recommend doing as much on the ground as you can before you leave. The N stands for NOTAMs. Check the NOTAMs. This includes the NOTAMs at your takeoff and landing locations and the NOTAMs in between. I plan to go in a lot more detail on NOTAMs in a future episode, but NOTAMs are one of the mandatory things you need to know before you take off. T stands for Takeoff and Landing Data. I call this TOL because if you turn takeoff and landing data into a little acronym, it makes another word and it makes you sound way cooler when you use it in front of your non-pilot friends. Anyway, you're required to know the runway links at airports of intended use, and you're required to know if you have enough runway. I went into excruciating detail on this in my video on performance. If you need more information on that, you'll want to check that out. For the S, this doesn't really apply to private pilots because it's an instrument thing. It stands for SIDS and STARS. But you don't need to know about that quite yet. But when the time comes, you can throw this into your bag of tricks. Now the one thing that isn't in my fancy little WANTS acronym is something that's just common sense. Fuel. You'll find the VFR fuel requirements in FAR 91-151. According to this, no person may begin a flight in an airplane under VFR conditions unless, considering wind and forecast weather conditions, there's enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing, and assuming normal cruising speed. During the day, we need to land with at least 30 minutes of fuel reserves. At night, we need to land with at least 45 minutes of fuel reserves. And this definition of night is talking about the normal legal definition of night. This would be evening civil twilight to morning civil twilight. And once again, that's roughly 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. Anyway, I hope you can remember your fuel requirements without an acronym. But I guess if you want, you can use FWANTS. Or you can just be a pilot and remember it. The choice is yours. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on the privileges and limitations for private pilots. And in my next lesson, I'm going to be discussing some of the flight rules you need to know when you're out flying around and stuff. When that video is done, I'm going to throw it right here. I'm I'm also starting an adventure channel with flying and other outdoor stuff. And this video right here is a small taste of what's over there. I plan on growing this channel right beside Free Pilot Training. Be sure to check it out and let me know what you guys think. I'll see you over there.